The snow didn't care that I had nowhere to go. It fell in thick, relentless sheets, pressing against my back like cold hands trying to push me forward. Or maybe down. I couldn't tell anymore. My boots had soaked through somewhere around the 3rd mile, and the numbness that had started in my toes had crept upward, until my legs felt less like mine, and more like borrowed things, unreliable and heavy. I stopped walking when the wind shifted, not because I wanted to stop. My body simply refused to take another step. My knees bent on their own, and I found myself kneeling in the snow at the edge of a tree line, hands pressed flat against the frozen ground, breathing in shallow, careful pulls of air that tasted like pine and ice. The weight I carried, the impossible, terrifying, precious weight, pressed forward, and I closed my eyes. Keep going, Penny. That's what I told myself. What I'd been telling myself for 4 days. 4 days since I left Coldmere Pack. 4 days since I walked out through the eastern gate in the gray hour before dawn, carrying nothing but a worn canvas bag, a handful of dried provisions, and the truth that no one in that pack wanted me to keep. I was 23 years old, an Omega with no rank worth mentioning, no family left to speak of, and a child growing inside me that the Pack Council had decided was a problem to be solved rather than a life to be welcomed. They hadn't said it cruelly. That was almost worse. How politely they'd framed my erasure. It would be better for everyone, Elder Doran had said, folding his hands on the table like we were discussing crop rotation. An unmated Omega in your condition is a burden the pack cannot carry through the winter season. I hadn't argued. I had learned long ago that Omegas who argued disappeared quietly. So I left quietly instead, on my own terms, which felt like the only victory left to take. The wind howled through the pines, and I forced myself back upright, one hand pressing against the curve of my stomach beneath my cloak. My blonde braid had come mostly undone, loose strands plastered to my forehead with melting snow. I probably looked like something the forest had chewed up and considered spitting out. And then I saw it. Through the trees, barely visible. But there, a shape that didn't belong to the wilderness. A roofline. Stone walls, dark with age and weather, but standing. A chimney, cold and smokeless. Windows shuttered from the inside, which meant the shutters were still attached, which meant the roof had probably held. I moved toward it before I'd made any conscious decision to do so. The house sat in a clearing that the forest seemed to have quietly swallowed over the years. Vines had climbed the eastern wall. The front steps were buried under half a foot of snow, and what looked like several seasons of fallen leaves underneath that. But the door, an old oak thing with iron fittings gone dark with rust, was intact. No broken hinges. No gaping holes where weather had forced its way inside. I tried the handle. It didn't open. Of course it didn't. I stood there for a moment, swaying slightly from exhaustion, and then I noticed that one of the ground floor shutters on the left side of the house had a gap at its lower corner. Just a gap. Wide enough, maybe, if I worked at it. It took longer than it should have. My fingers were clumsy, and I had to stop twice to rest, leaning my forehead against the cold stone wall and breathing through the ache in my lower back that had become my constant companion these past weeks. But eventually the shutter swung inward with a groan of protest, and the window behind it, old glass, wavy and thick, was unlatched. I climbed through with considerably less grace than the word climbed implies. Inside, the darkness smelled of dust and cold ash, and something underneath both of those things. Something that had once been a home. Wood smoke, long faded. Dried herbs hanging from a ceiling beam, brittle and colorless with age. A table with 2 chairs. A hearth wide enough to stand inside. And beside the hearth, a stack of firewood that someone had left, or forgotten, or perhaps placed there with the quiet faith that someone who needed it would eventually arrive. I stood very still in the middle of that dark, cold room, and I cried. Not dramatically. Not the kind of crying that demands an audience. Just the quiet, helpless kind. Tears running down my face while I stood there with my canvas bag at my feet and my hands pressed to my stomach, feeling the faint, fluttering movement of the life inside me that had no idea how precarious our situation was. "It's all right," I told them silently. "I found us something. I found flint and steel in the kitchen drawer, which struck me as almost miraculous. The fire took on the third attempt, and I fed it carefully, adding small pieces first and then larger ones, watching the orange light spread across the stone floor. The room began to warm by degrees. I draped my wet cloak over one of the chairs near the hearth and sat on the floor with my back against the warm stone, my hands wrapped around my knees, and I looked around at what I'd found. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was dry. It was mine, at least for tonight. I ate half of what remained in my bag: dried meat, a heel of hard bread, 2 shriveled apples, and I told myself tomorrow I would inventory the house properly. There might be more provisions somewhere. A cellar, perhaps. There were often cellars in old houses like this. I was almost asleep when I heard it, a sound from somewhere outside. Not the wind, which had a voice I'd grown familiar with over 4 days of walking. Something else, something that moved with intention through the snow. Multiple somethings. I sat up slowly, my heart loud in the sudden silence of my own attention. The fire crackled. Outside, snow fell. And then, unmistakably, I heard the low sound of wolves communicating. Not howling. Not the open, territorial announcement that carried for miles. This was quieter. Closer. The kind of sound a patrol makes when it's checking a perimeter. I pressed myself against the wall beside the window, not daring to look out. Who does this land belong to? I hadn't thought to ask that question when I was climbing through the window. I hadn't thought of much beyond warmth and rest. But now, kneeling on the floor of someone else's abandoned house with firelight flickering against the shuttered windows like a beacon I had inadvertently lit, I understood, with cold clarity, that I had just announced my presence to whoever owned this territory. The sound of paw steps in snow stopped directly outside the front door, and then someone knocked. I didn't move. The knock came again. 3 measured strikes against the oak door, deliberate and unhurried. Not the frantic pounding of someone caught in the storm. Not the sharp, aggressive demand of an enforcer who already knew they had the authority to break the door down if they chose. This was something in between, and somehow that middle space frightened me more than either extreme. I looked at the window I'd climbed through. Still open. I could go back out into the snow. I could disappear into the tree line before whoever was on the other side of that door had time to process what they'd found. I was slow now, heavier than I'd ever been in my life, and the cold would find me within the hour. But the instinct to run was so deeply wired into me that my legs were already shifting beneath me before my mind caught up. And go where, Penny? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Go where? Back into the snow. Back into 4 more days of walking toward nothing in particular, with less food than before, and a body that had already told me, in no uncertain terms, that it was reaching the edge of what it could sustain. I pressed my hand flat against the wall and stayed where I was. "We can see the smoke from the chimney," a voice said from outside. Low, even, carrying easily through the old wood of the door. Male, young or youngish, not the graveled authority of an elder. "We're not going to pretend we don't know someone is inside." I said nothing. A pause. Then a different voice, this one slightly higher, carrying a note of something almost like wry amusement. "She's not going to answer, Cole. She might. She climbed through a window to get in. She's not going to open the door to a pack patrol in the middle of the night." They knew about the window, which meant they'd circled the house, which meant they were thorough, and I hadn't heard all of them, only the ones who'd approached the front. My name is Coldmere, the first voice said. I'm the patrol lead for the Ashvale territory. This land belongs to Alpha King Kale. I'm not here to cause you harm, but I need you to open this door, or I need you to tell me you're all right, because those are the only two options that don't end with me reporting an unresponsive trespasser to the Alpha and watching this get significantly more complicated than it needs to be. The Alpha King. I had heard that name. Everyone had heard that name. Kale of Ashvale, the king who had consolidated 4 fractured territories into one in less than 3 years, who was said to govern with a coldness that wasn't cruelty so much as an absolute absence of sentiment. Not a monster, by most accounts, but not a story that ended comfortably for Omegas, who trespassed on his land without invitation. I stood up. My legs protested. My back protested more. But I crossed the room, and I put my hand on the door latch, and I said, loudly enough to be heard, I'm going to open the door. I'm not armed. I'm not a threat to anyone. A beat of silence. All right. I opened it. The cold rushed in immediately, and I had to grip the door frame against the sudden shock of it. There were 3 of them on the steps. 2 I catalogued quickly as patrol wolves in dark, practical clothing, hands visible, postures carefully non-aggressive in the way that trained enforcers learn when they want to de-escalate. The one in front, Coldmere, presumably, was perhaps 30, with a steady, dark-eyed gaze that swept over me in a single assessing pass, and then went very, very still. I watched him recalibrate. Whatever he'd expected to find, a rogue, a criminal, a territorial threat, he had not expected a woman with a blonde braid, half fallen out of its tie, dark circles under her eyes, a worn cloak dripping snowmelt on the threshold, and the unmistakable silhouette of late pregnancy beneath her traveling dress. Oh, he said. Just that. I didn't know whose territory this was, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I've been walking for 4 days. I saw the house. I needed shelter. I'll leave at first light if that's what's required. Cole looked at the wolf to his left, who looked back at him with an expression I couldn't fully read. Then Cole looked at me again and said, with the careful tone of someone choosing their words with great deliberation, Where did you come from? Coldmere. Something shifted in the air between the 3 of them. Not alarm exactly. Recognition, maybe. Or the particular quality of silence that falls when people know more than they're going to say out loud. That's 4 days northeast, the wolf on the left said slowly. On foot. Yes. Alone? Yes. Cole was quiet for a moment. The snow fell around us, indifferent to the weight of the conversation. Then he said, I can't let you stay here unsupervised on Ashvale land. That's not something within my authority to permit. He paused. But I'm also not going to walk away from this situation and pretend I didn't find it. That's not something I'm willing to do. What does that mean, practically speaking? It means, he said carefully, that I'm going to have to bring you in, to the main estate, to report to the Alpha King. The words landed with a weight I felt in my chest. The Alpha King. I thought about Elder Doran's politely folded hands. I thought about how easily the powerful disposed of inconvenient Omegas when the math of it suited them. And if I refuse? I asked. Cole's expression didn't change, but something in it softened, just slightly, in the way that people do when they're about to tell you a truth they wish they didn't have to. Then I report an uncooperative trespasser, and someone else comes instead of me. And I can't promise that someone else will stand here and have this conversation with you. I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the snow behind him, thick and unrelenting. I looked down at my hands, still gripping the doorframe. I thought of the life I was carrying, who had no voice in this and no choice in this, who was depending entirely on mine. All right, I said. Let me get my bag. The Ashvale estate was not what I had imagined in the dark of the road. I had built it in my mind as something severe and cold. All stone angles and narrow windows, a place designed to project dominance rather than shelter anything living. What I found? When Cole's patrol brought me through the outer gates as the night deepened toward its earliest morning hours, was something that defied that picture entirely. The estate was vast, yes, but it had clearly been added to over generations. Older stone buildings connected to newer timber construction, lanterns burning along covered walkways, the sound of a river somewhere below the eastern slope. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and something warm underneath, the collective breath of a large household that had been there for a long time. A woman met us at the inner door, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, with the no-nonsense posture of someone who managed large numbers of people and had long since stopped being surprised by anything. She looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient brought in from the cold, quickly, clinically, cataloging what needed to be addressed. "I'm Nara," she said. "I run the household. Come inside." "The Alpha," Cole began. "Will be informed in the morning," Nara said, with a tone that closed the subject completely. "She's exhausted. Whatever this is can wait until she's eaten and rested." I followed her inside. She put me in a room on the ground floor, small but clean, with a bed that had actual quilts, a fire already burning, and a basin of warm water on the table. She brought food herself. Soup, bread, a cup of something herbed and warm that she said without preamble was good for the kind of exhaustion I was clearly carrying. I ate everything. When she came back to take the dishes, she paused at the door and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in long enough that it took me a moment to name it. Concern. Genuine, uncomplicated concern. "Sleep," she said. "Nothing is going to happen to you tonight." I believed her, which surprised me. I lay back against the pillow in that small, warm room, listening to the house breathe around me, the distant sounds of other people, other lives, the creak of old timber settling in the cold. My hand rested on my stomach. The flutter I'd felt earlier came again, brief and certain, like a question being asked. Are we safe? I didn't know. I had no way of knowing. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of an Alpha King and explain myself, and I had no power and no leverage and nothing to offer except the truth of my situation, which powerful people had already shown me they found inconvenient. But tonight the fire was warm. Tonight someone had brought me soup without asking anything in return. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 4 days, I let myself sleep. I didn't dream, but somewhere in the deepest part of that sleep, I had the strange, irrational sense that something was watching over the house. Not threateningly, the way certain things in the world are simply present, patient, enduring, and unmoved by weather. I didn't know it then. But in the morning, I would find out that Alpha King Kale had been awake when Cole's report arrived, that he had come down the hall himself, silently, and stood outside my door for a long moment before turning away, and that he had told Nara to make sure the fire didn't go out. I woke to gray morning light pressing through the curtain gap and the distant sound of the household already in motion. For exactly 3 seconds, I didn't remember where I was. I felt only the warmth of the quilts, the softness beneath me that was so foreign after 4 nights on frozen ground that my body had apparently decided it was a hallucination and refused to fully accept it. Then memory returned in a quiet rush. The snow, the house, Cole's measured voice on the doorstep, Nara's soup. And with it came the awareness that today was the day I would have to account for myself to someone who had every reason to send me back out into the cold. I sat up slowly and took stock. My boots had been cleaned and set near the hearth to finish drying. My cloak, which had been draped over the chair when I fell asleep, had been moved to a hook on the wall. On the table beside the basin, there was now a small breakfast: bread, butter, a boiled egg, a cup of tea gone slightly cool, that hadn't been there when I'd closed my eyes. Someone had come in while I slept and done these small, careful things without waking me. I sat with that for a moment. It was such a simple set of gestures, and yet I could not remember the last time anyone had done something for me without calculating what they would need in return. I ate. I washed my face. I rebraided my blonde hair as neatly as I could manage, which was not very neatly. My hands weren't quite steady. And then I sat on the edge of the bed and waited, because there was nothing else to do. Nara came for me an hour later. She didn't offer me reassurances on the walk through the estate's interior hallways, which I found I appreciated more than I would have appreciated false comfort. She walked at a pace that accommodated mine without making a production of it, and she pointed out, in the tone of someone passing along practical information rather than making conversation. The Alpha King has been informed of the situation. He will hear what you have to say before any decision is made. He does not make decisions without information. That much I can tell you with certainty. What kind of man is he? I asked. Nara was quiet for a few steps. Precise, she said finally. He says what he means. He does not enjoy people who waste his time with apologies or theater. Tell him the truth plainly, and you will fare better than most. The hallway opened into a broader corridor, then into a room that stopped me at the threshold for a moment. Not because it was intimidating in the way throne rooms are designed to intimidate, with their high ceilings and their deliberate coldness. It was the opposite. It was clearly a working room, a large table covered in maps, ledgers stacked at one end, 2 chairs pulled close to a hearth where a fire burned steadily. Bookshelves lined 2 walls. Morning light came through tall windows that looked out on a landscape of snow-covered hills rolling away toward a dark tree line. And standing at those windows, his back to the room, was Kale. I had built a picture of him from the stories that traveled between packs, the way all important rumors travel. Carried in the mouths of traders and messengers, embellished at every stop. I expected someone designed to look powerful, broad and cold and deliberately imposing, the physical embodiment of authority. What I found was a man who simply stood very still. He was tall, yes. That part the stories had right. Dark-haired, with the kind of build that spoke of a life that demanded physical capability, rather than one that cultivated it for appearance. But what I noticed first, in the moment before he turned, was the stillness itself. The quality of someone who had learned to occupy space without announcing it. Someone who watched more than he spoke, and thought more than he watched. He turned when Nara closed the door behind me. His eyes were the color of deep water. Gray-green, difficult to read in the way that water is difficult to read, showing you a surface while hiding the depth beneath. They moved over me in the same assessing way Coles had the night before, but slower, more thorough. Not unkind, but entirely honest in their attention, which was somehow more uncomfortable than unkindness would have been. "Sit down," he said. "Not please sit, and not you may sit. Just the simple directive, without ceremony." I remembered what Nara had said about theater, and I crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the hearth without comment. He remained standing. Not in the way that people stand to assert height over someone seated. He moved to the side of the table and leaned against it, which actually brought him closer to my level, and looked at me with that steady, water-deep gaze. "Your name," he said. "Penny. Pack. Coldmere, formerly." A slight pause at that word. Formerly. "You left." "I did." "Before or after they asked you to?" The question was so direct that it landed like a small stone dropped from a height. I felt the impact of it somewhere behind my sternum. He wasn't asking to be cruel. I could hear that. He was asking because he already had a theory, and he wanted to know if the truth matched it. "They made it clear," I said carefully, "that remaining would cause problems for everyone involved." Including you? Especially me. He nodded once, slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. Coldmere's council, he said, has a history of resolving inconvenient situations by relocating them rather than addressing them. I'm familiar with Elder Doran's methods. I looked at him. You know Doran. I know of him. There's a difference, and it's not a flattering one in his case. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the window, on the gray winter light spreading across the hills. Then he looked back at me. You walked 4 days through the Ashvale wilderness in the middle of the season's worst snowfall and took shelter in an abandoned property on my land. That tells me either you were desperate or you were reckless. Looking at you, I think it was the first one. Both, probably, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not yet. But an acknowledgement of something. A slight easing of the precision he wore the way other people wore armor. The house you found, he said, belonged to my uncle. He died 3 years ago. I haven't decided what to do with it. He paused. It needed the chimney checked. Cole tells me the fire burned cleanly, which suggests the flue is still sound. I had the disorienting sense that he was telling me something sideways, something that wasn't quite the conversation we appeared to be having. I'm not asking for charity, I said. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking for... I don't know exactly what I'm asking for. Time, maybe. A few days to rest and to think and to figure out where I'm going next. I have nothing to offer in return except honesty, and I understand if that's not enough. Kale studied me for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, a crow called once from somewhere in the snow-covered eaves, and then went silent. What do you know about Ashvale? He asked. The question surprised me. Not much. That it's larger than it looks from the outside. That you consolidated the northern territories. That you govern alone. That last part, he said, is more complicated than it sounds. He pushed off from the table and walked to the window again, looking out at those rolling hills. I have 4 territories under one banner, and a council that represents each of them. The council has been vocal lately about certain gaps in Ashvale's leadership structure. They believe a pack of this size requires more than administrative competence. They believe it requires visible continuity. I wasn't entirely sure what he was telling me or why he was telling me, but I kept quiet and let him speak. I mention it, he said, still looking at the window. Not to burden you with politics you didn't ask about. I mention it because I want you to understand that Ashvale is a territory in the middle of its own complicated season, and that what I do with your situation will be noticed and discussed, because everything I do is noticed and discussed. He turned back to face me. I need to think about what the right decision is. And I'm going to ask you not to make any plans to leave until I've had a day to think. I stared at him. You're asking me to stay. I'm asking you to wait, he said. There's a difference. I thought about pointing out that I had nowhere to go, which would have made the request somewhat academic. But something in the careful precision of his phrasing stopped me. He was not offering me charity. He was not making me a prisoner. He was asking genuinely for time, and treating me as someone capable of granting or refusing it. No one had treated me that way in longer than I could easily remember. All right, I said. One day. He nodded. And then, as if the conversation had reached a natural conclusion, and he saw no reason to pad it with social ritual, he walked back to his table and picked up a map, and I understood that I was being quietly dismissed. Not unkindly, but thoroughly. Nara was waiting in the hall. She looked at my face, apparently read something in it that satisfied her, and said, "Come. I'll show you the rest of the house." I followed her, my hand resting on my stomach, turning over the conversation in my mind like a stone found on a path. Smooth on one side, rough on the other, and heavier than it looked. That afternoon, sitting in the warm kitchen while Nara's staff moved around me with the comfortable efficiency of people who knew their work well, one of the younger women, a girl of perhaps 19 named Bess, with quick hands and a quicker smile, sat across from me with 2 cups of tea and said conversationally, "You know, the Alpha hasn't asked anyone to stay in years." I looked at her. "I'm sure he has guests." "Guests are different," Bess said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "Guests are invited and scheduled and managed. He asked you." She tilted her head. "He came down the hall himself last night. Did Nara tell you that?" "She didn't. He stood outside your door for a bit." She said it matter-of-factly, without weight, as if it were simply an interesting detail rather than a significant one. "Then he went back upstairs and told the night staff to keep your fire going." She took a sip of her tea. "He hasn't done anything like that in a long time." I looked down at my cup and said nothing, but my hand had stilled against my stomach, and somewhere in the careful architecture of walls I'd spent years building around myself, something shifted. Just slightly, like a single stone moving in a wall that had been perfectly still for a very long time. One day became 3. I didn't plan it that way. On the second morning, I woke expecting Kale to summon me back to that map-covered room and deliver whatever verdict he'd spent the night constructing. Instead, Nara appeared at my door with a heavier dress draped over her arm, wool, deep gray, practical and warm, and said that the Alpha had been called into an all-day council session, and that I was welcome to move through the household freely until he was available. I borrowed the dress. It fit better than anything I'd worn in months. By the 3rd day, I had stopped counting hours. The estate had a rhythm that was nothing like Coldmere's. In Coldmere, the pack hierarchy made itself felt in 100 small daily ways. Who ate first, who spoke first, who moved aside in corridors and who didn't. The air there had always carried a faint pressure, like weather before a storm, the constant low hum of rank asserting itself over everything. I had lived inside that pressure so long I'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that never stops. Here, the pressure was different in quality. Present, unmistakably, this was a pack under strong leadership, but not oppressive in the same way. The staff moved with purpose rather than anxiety. People disagreed with each other openly in the kitchens and the workrooms, and then continued working side by side, without the disagreement becoming a wound. Bess argued cheerfully with the head cook about the correct way to salt a broth, and nobody's rank was invoked even once. I watched all of this with the attention of someone who had been quietly studying social structures their entire adult life, because when you exist at the bottom of a hierarchy, understanding how power moves through a space is a survival skill rather than an intellectual exercise. What I concluded, by the end of the 3rd day, was that Ashvale ran the way it did because the person at the top of it had decided, deliberately, that it would. That the tone of a territory begins with its leader and filters downward through every interaction until it becomes the water everyone swims in without thinking about it. And that Kale, whatever else he was, whatever complications surrounded his governance, had chosen to build something that didn't feed on fear. That told me something important about him. I filed it away carefully. I saw him only once during those 3 days, briefly, at a distance. He was crossing the courtyard below the window where I'd been sitting with a book from the household's small library, moving quickly, in conversation with 2 men who carried the look of council representatives, their expressions tight with whatever argument was currently in motion. He glanced up once, seemingly by accident, and our eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds before he looked away and continued walking. 2 seconds. I returned to my book and found I'd lost my place entirely. On the 4th morning, Nara told me the Alpha would see me after the midday meal. I spent the intervening hours in the estate's small garden, more of a walled courtyard, really, the plants all dormant under their layer of snow, but sheltered from the wind and bright with winter light. I walked the perimeter slowly, the way my body preferred these days, one hand at my lower back, thinking about what I was going to say. The truth plainly, Nara had advised. But truth was a more complicated thing than the word suggested. There was the plain, factual truth. I am Penny, formerly of Coldmere, Omega rank, 23 years old, alone and without resources, and carrying a child whose father had left the pack 8 months ago and had not returned and was not coming back. That was the skeleton of the situation. It was true as far as it went. What it didn't carry was the texture of it, the particular quality of loneliness that comes not from being physically isolated, but from being surrounded by people who have collectively decided you don't quite matter enough to include. The way I had spent the last 3 years making myself useful, healing the sick, managing the pack's herb stores, teaching the younger Omegas what I knew about plant medicine, and how none of that usefulness had translated into the kind of belonging that would have made my situation anyone's problem but my own. I was good at being useful. I had never learned how to be necessary. The difference I had come to understand was the thing that determined whether people let you stay. Kale was alone in the map room when Nara brought me in. The council representatives were gone. The table had been partially cleared. The ledgers stacked more neatly. A space opened up that hadn't been there before. He was standing at the window again, which I was beginning to think was simply where he stood when he was thinking. The way some people pace, and others go still. He turned when I entered, and this time I noticed that he looked tired. Not visibly, in the way of someone who'd slept badly. More the tiredness that accumulates over time. The kind that rest doesn't entirely fix, because it isn't born from sleeplessness, but from carrying weight for long periods without setting it down. I recognized that kind of tired. I'd seen it in my own reflection. "Sit down," he said. Same as before, direct, without ceremony. I sat. He remained standing for a moment, and then, apparently deciding something, he pulled the second chair away from the table and sat in it himself, which put us at the same level, facing each other across a few feet of space with the fire at his left and the window's gray light at mine. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About asking for time, about having nothing to offer except honesty." "I remember. I've also been doing some inquiry, quietly." He said it without apology, which I found I preferred to an apology. Coldmere's internal politics are more visible than Elder Doran would like to believe. The decision to ask you to leave was not unanimous. There were 3 council members who objected. They were overruled by Doran and 2 others who have been managing the pack's public image above its people's welfare for some time. A pause. That's not to say the decision wasn't legal by Coldmere's own governance structure. It was. I'm simply telling you what the inquiry found. "Why?" I asked. "Because I want you to know that I looked, that I don't make decisions about people based on what one side of a story presents." He rested his forearms on his knees, a gesture that struck me as unconsciously less formal than everything else about him. And because what I'm about to say will make more sense if you understand that I investigated rather than assumed. I waited. "Ashvale has a healer position," he said. "The woman who held it for 15 years retired at the start of this season to live closer to her daughter's family in the Southern Territory. We've been managing without one since then. The council has been pushing me to appoint someone from a shortlist they've compiled." A slight pause. "I find the shortlist politically motivated rather than practically sound." I looked at him very carefully. "You know I have training in plant medicine. Nara spoke to you for 3 days. Nara doesn't speak at length to people she doesn't find worth speaking to." He met my gaze directly. "She also told me that you identified correctly, and without being asked, that the herb bundles in the abandoned house were marsh rosemary and late yarrow, and that the combination suggested whoever lived there had been managing a long-term joint condition. That's not common knowledge." It's also not formal training, I said honestly. I learned from the Pack's healer at Coldmere. I worked alongside her for 6 years, but I don't have a credential that a council could point to. And the previous Ashvale healer had no formal credential either. She had knowledge and judgment. He paused. What I'm proposing, and I want to be clear that this is a proposal, not a directive, is that you take a temporary position as Ashvale's working healer. Housing would be provided within the estate. Meals, supplies, everything practical that the role requires. The arrangement would be assessed after 6 months by both of us, and either party could end it with appropriate notice. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled. I could hear faintly the sound of the courtyard below. Someone calling to someone else, a dog barking once and then going silent. You'd be offering shelter to an unmated Omega in late pregnancy, I said. In a territory where your council is already making noise about your leadership. That's not a neutral political gesture. No, he agreed. It's not. Why would you do that? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how honest to be with an answer they already have. Because the alternative, he said finally, is to send you back out into the snow, and that is not something I'm willing to do. He said it the same way he said everything, plainly, without decoration, as if it were simply a fact about himself that he was reporting. Ashvale's strength has never come from its size or its political alliances. It's come from the choices made when the choices weren't easy. I'd rather explain a decision that was right than defend one that was convenient. I looked at my hands for a long moment. Then I looked up at him. There's something you should know, I said, about why I'm in this situation. The full version, not the outline. I assumed there was, he said, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, in the way of someone prepared to listen for as long as it took, and said nothing else. So I told him. All of it. Not the rehearsed version I'd been constructing in the garden, but the real one, with all its irregular edges. The father who had been a traveler passing through Coldmere, charming and temporary, who had spoken about returning in a way that I had believed, because I had wanted to believe it. The months of managing alone, doing my work, keeping my head down, telling myself that it would resolve itself, and that I was capable of handling whatever came. The council meeting I hadn't been invited to attend, where my future had been decided without my presence. The morning I had walked out through the eastern gate with my canvas bag and my dried provisions, and the absolute certainty that whatever came next would be better than staying where I wasn't wanted. Kale listened through all of it without interrupting once. His expression didn't shift toward pity, which I had dreaded. It stayed in that steady, attentive register, someone receiving information and treating it with the seriousness it deserved. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said, for the full version. I nodded. My answer is the same, he said. The position is yours if you want it. I thought of Bess's easy laugh in the kitchen, of Nara's no-nonsense competence and her quiet gestures of care, of the courtyard in winter light and the way the estate breathed around its inhabitants like something living, of the fire that had been kept burning through the night for someone who was, at that point, still a stranger. Yes, I said. I want it. Something in his expression settled. Not dramatically, not the way relief looks in stories. Just a quiet resolution, like a held breath released. He stood and extended his hand across the space between us, a formal gesture of agreement, the kind exchanged between equals confirming a decision. I stood and shook it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely straightforward, and when he released my hand, he said, Nara will arrange the healer's quarters. They're better than the room you've been in, warmer, with more space. He paused. You'll need this space. In a few weeks. It was perhaps the most understated acknowledgement of the situation anyone had ever offered me. I found, unexpectedly, that it made me want to laugh. A real laugh. The kind that had been very scarce lately. I managed to keep it to a smile. He noticed. And this time, the slight shift in his expression moved clearly enough in one direction that I could name it without uncertainty. He smiled back. Winter broke slowly, the way it always does in the Northern Territories, not in a single dramatic thaw, but in increments, one gray morning at a time, until you look out the window one day and realize the light has changed quality without you noticing exactly when. I noticed it on a Tuesday in late February, standing in the healer's workroom that had become, over the past 6 weeks, the most genuinely mine that any space had ever felt. The herbs I'd gathered from the estate's dried stores were arranged along the window shelf in the order I preferred. My notes, observations, formulations, the careful records of every member of the pack I'd treated since taking the position, filled 2 ledgers that I'd requested from the household stores and received without question. The work table smelled of dried lavender and pine resin and the particular clean sharpness of yarrow, and when the morning light came through those windows, it fell across everything in a way that made the room look like something from a painting, rather than a real place where real work happened. I had treated 41 pack members in 6 weeks. Everything from winter coughs and inflamed joints to a badly sprained wrist on one of the patrol wolves who had fallen during a night crossing and hadn't wanted to report it because he was, in Bess's affectionate assessment, deeply stubborn about that kind of thing. His name was Wren, the same wolf who'd stood to Cole's left on my doorstep that first night, the one with the slightly amused voice. He'd sat in my workroom with the expression of someone enduring something mildly beneath their dignity, while I wrapped his wrist. And then he'd come back 3 days later to tell me it felt better, and stayed for an hour talking about the territory's eastern boundaries, with the ease of someone who had decided, somewhere between the doorstep and the workroom, that I was trustworthy. That was how it happened with most of them. Not dramatically. Not with formal declarations of acceptance. Just gradually, and then all at once. The way trust tends to move when it moves honestly. Cole checked in every few days, officially to report on patrol activities that intersected with anything health-related, unofficially because he had appointed himself something between a liaison and a quiet guardian, and seemed to feel that keeping an eye on things was both his responsibility and his preference. He didn't make a production of it. He simply appeared, asked useful questions, listened to the answers, and left having made whatever small adjustment needed making. Bess came every morning with tea, and stayed as long as the kitchen would let her, which was usually longer than it should have, and filled the workroom with the particular warm noise of someone who finds silence uncomfortable and has decided that you are a suitable audience for everything that crosses her mind. And Nara managed the household with the same precise, undemonstrative competence she brought to everything, and expressed her regard for people not through words, but through the quality of her attention to their practical needs. She had, without announcement, arranged for the healer's quarters to be fitted with an additional brazier before the worst of February's cold arrived. She had sourced, from somewhere in the estate's considerable stores, a supply of the specific dried elderflower that I'd mentioned, in passing, was difficult to find in the Northern Territories, but extremely useful for fever management. She had done both of these things and said nothing about either of them, which I had come to understand was simply how she operated. These people had become, not without my noticing, but somewhat against my prior expectation that it was possible, my people. Not in the formal, hierarchical sense that pack membership implies, in the older, quieter sense. The sense of people whose faces you know, and whose voices you recognize, and whose well-being you find yourself thinking about when you wake in the morning. I had not expected that. I had expected to be tolerated. I had arrived prepared for tolerance, with all my defenses calibrated for it. What I'd gotten instead had required a completely different set of responses, and learning them had been the most disorienting and quietly wonderful thing that had happened to me in years. Kale and I had developed our own rhythm in the weeks since our agreement. It was not what I would have predicted from that first meeting. I'd anticipated formal distance, the professional courtesy of a leader toward a useful appointee, correct and unmistakable in its limits. What actually developed was something more complicated and more interesting. He came to the workroom twice a week, ostensibly to review whatever health matters he needed to be informed about as pack leader. Outbreaks, injuries, anything systemic that his governance needed to account for. In practice, these meetings regularly extended past the practical agenda into something that was simply conversation. He asked questions that suggested he had been thinking about things we'd discussed previously. I asked questions back, because I had learned that he preferred exchange to performance, and because I was genuinely curious about how he thought. He had been the Alpha King for 6 years. He had taken on the role at 28, following the death of his father, in a territory that was already beginning to fracture along old boundary lines. The consolidation of the 4 territories, the thing that had made his name, had taken 3 years of negotiations, compromises, and at least 2 situations that he described in the brief, neutral language of someone who has processed difficult events and filed them away rather than carrying them constantly forward. He was, I had concluded, a man who felt things deeply and had learned to express them obliquely. Not out of coldness, but out of a precision about language, a sense that words meant things and should therefore be used carefully rather than abundantly. He said less than most people and meant more by what he said, and once I understood that, conversations with him became a different experience entirely. You had to listen at a different frequency. I told him this one afternoon in early March, sitting across from him at the work table while snow still dusted the window ledge outside, but the light had already begun to carry the particular golden quality that announced spring's eventual arrival. He looked at me for a moment. "Most people find that frustrating," he said. "Most people want to be handed things," I said. "I've spent my whole life learning to read what wasn't being said directly. You just happen to be worth reading." A silence, the kind that has texture. "You're very straightforward," he said. "For someone who spent years being told their observations didn't matter." "They told me my rank didn't matter," I said. "I never agreed about the observations." He looked at me with that water-deep gaze for a long moment, and then he said quietly and without preamble, "I'm glad Cole's patrol found you." I thought about the snow that night, the chimney smoke rising through the dark, the terrifying, exhausted calculation I'd made at the threshold between running and staying. "So am I said. My daughter arrived on the 14th of March, in the early morning hours when the household was just beginning to stir. Nara was there, and the estate's midwife, a calm, experienced woman named Petra, who had delivered more than 40 pack children and approached the entire endeavor with a brisk, cheerful competence that I found enormously steadying. Bess was there too, in the corner, officially for moral support, and unofficially because no one had been able to convince her to leave, and she had spent the last 2 hours holding my hand and talking about completely unrelated things in the evident belief that distraction was a form of medicine, which honestly was not wrong. She was small and pink, and furious about being in the world, my daughter. She announced herself with a cry that seemed entirely too loud for something so newly made, and then quieted the moment she was placed against my chest, as if she had simply needed to establish that she had a voice and was prepared to use it. I looked at her face, the improbable perfection of it, the way she already seemed to be thinking about something. Small brow furrowed with the effort of processing a world that was overwhelming and entirely new. And I felt something so large and so simple that I didn't have a word for it. I named her Wren. After the smallest bird, which is also among the loudest. Kyle came to the doorway an hour later, when the room had settled into quiet and Petra and Nara had stepped out to give me space. He stopped at the threshold in a way that made it clear he would not enter without being invited, which was so exactly him that it made something in my chest ache with a warmth I no longer tried to name with caution. "Come in," I said. He crossed the room and looked at Wren with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something completely unguarded, all his precision temporarily set aside, the way a person looks at something that disarms every defense simply by existing. "She's very small," he said. "She's very loud," I said. "She comes by it honestly." He looked at me then, and I saw the same unguarded thing still in his eyes, wider now and directed at me. And I understood that whatever complicated sideways thing had been building between us over these weeks of workroom conversations and careful distances and small gestures that meant more than they said, it had arrived somewhere, not with ceremony, not with declaration, just with the quiet certainty of something that had been true for a while and was simply now acknowledged. "She has somewhere to be," he said finally. "Both of you do." He said it in that way he had, plain and direct, and meaning more than the words. "I want you to know that. Whatever you decide, going forward, about what this is and what you want from it, you have somewhere to be. In Ashvale. I mean that without conditions." I looked at him for a long moment. My daughter made a small sound in my arms and settled deeper into sleep. "I know," I said. "I've known for a while." Spring came fully by April. The courtyard garden woke up in stages, snowdrops first, then the earliest crocuses pushing through softened earth, then the gradual return of green to the hills beyond the estate walls. The pack moved differently in spring, lighter, the accumulated weight of winter months releasing slowly from collective shoulders. Wren grew the way new things do, rapidly, and with a single-minded commitment to the business of existing that I found instructive. She was curious and stubborn, and had a way of looking at unfamiliar people with an evaluating steadiness that Cole, meeting her for the first time at 6 weeks old, said reminded him uncomfortably of the Alpha King, which made Kale, who was standing nearby, go entirely still for a moment, before something in his expression shifted into what I had learned to recognize as the version of amusement he allowed himself in company he trusted. The council, for their part, had surprised me. There were 2 members who had opposed my appointment quietly, and continued to do so, in the way of people who have decided their position is a matter of principle, rather than examining whether the principle still applies. But the majority had come around, not through argument, but through the simpler mechanism of watching the pack's health outcomes improve over the winter months and finding it difficult to argue with results. Wren had become, improbably, something of an advocate. Not by making speeches, but by telling the truth plainly when people asked, which in a pack like Ashvale carried more weight than any formal endorsement. In June, 3 months after Wren's arrival, Kale and I walked the eastern hills together in the long evening light of early summer. Wren was with Bess, who had been campaigning for unsupervised time with her since approximately the 2nd week, and had finally been granted it with the understanding that any report of chaos would result in its immediate rescission. We walked slowly, the hills green and wide around us, the estate visible behind us in the last of the golden light. We talked about small things first. The herb garden's summer inventory, a dispute between 2 of the Northern Territory representatives that had resolved itself more peacefully than expected. Wren's new habit of grabbing whatever came within reach and examining it with total concentration. And then, in the natural pause that came after the small things had been said, Kale stopped walking and turned to face me with the look of someone who has been thinking about something for long enough that they've decided the time for thinking is finished. "I have something to say," he said, "and I want to say it plainly." "You always say things plainly," I said. "Not always," he said. "Not about this." A pause. "I asked you to stay because it was the right thing to do. I told you that then, and it was true. But somewhere between then and now, my reasons changed. And I think you know that. And I think I've been conducting myself as though you knowing it was the same as my having said it, which is not fair to you and not honest of me. The evening light made everything look like a memory already, soft and golden and too beautiful to be quite real. "You're saying it now," I said. "I'm saying it now." He looked at me with that water-deep gaze that I had spent months learning to read, and what I saw in it was the thing I'd been careful not to name for fear of being wrong. You and Wren are not here because of charity or politics, or what the council finds convenient. You're here because this is where you belong. And I would very much like, if you're willing, to stop pretending that's not what I believe. I thought of the eastern gate at Coldmere. Gray dawn, canvas bag over my shoulder, walking into the snow because staying had become impossible. I thought of the abandoned house and the fire I'd built from someone else's woodpile, and the knock on the door that I'd almost not answered. I thought of all the ways that life had been trying to bring me somewhere I didn't know to look for. I'm willing, I said. He nodded once. And then he did something I had not seen him do with anyone. He offered me his hand, not in the formal way of an agreement being sealed, but simply open, offered, the way you offer something you hope will be accepted without conditions. I took it. We stood on the green hill in the summer evening, and the estate waited below us, full of firelight and familiar voices, and a small daughter being cheerfully spoiled by someone who had decided she was a personal responsibility. The river caught the last of the sun somewhere below the eastern slope, and the hills rolled away in every direction, wide and unhurried, patient in the way that land is patient, having seen everything and rushing nothing. There was no ceremony to mark the moment, no public declaration. Just two people on a hillside deciding together, which was the most honest form that any decision could take. In the years that followed, Ashvale grew quieter in the way that territories do when they have found their equilibrium. The council debates continued, because governance requires debate to function honestly. But the particular anxiety that had hummed underneath those early months resolved into something steadier. The healer's workroom expanded into 2 rooms when the volume of work required it. Wren became the patrol's second, a promotion that he received with the exact level of affected indifference that everyone expected, and then immediately applied himself to with total dedication. Cole remained patrol lead until he chose, at his own time and on his own terms, to step back into an advisory role that suited him better. Bess, as predicted by everyone who knew her, became indispensable to the household in approximately 7 different capacities simultaneously, and seemed to find this arrangement entirely satisfactory. Nara retired from active household management when Wren was 4 years old, in the quiet, deliberate way that Nara did everything. After ensuring that every system she had built continued to function perfectly without her. She moved into a smaller house on the estate grounds and spent her mornings in the garden and her afternoons, frequently in the healer's workroom, where she had discovered a late-life interest in plant medicine that I suspected had always been there and simply needed room. Wren grew up in the green hills and the long corridors and the warmth of a household that had always treated her as belonging to all of them collectively, which she accepted as her natural due with the easy confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt her welcome. She had her father's stillness, and her mother's habit of watching carefully before speaking, and a laugh that Bess claimed was loud enough to be heard from the courtyard, which was probably accurate. She was 7 when she asked me, one evening in the healer's workroom where she often came to sit while I worked, why we had come to Ashvale. I thought about it for a moment, about all the true answers, the snow, the exhaustion, the window I'd climbed through in the dark. I was looking for somewhere safe, I told her, and I found somewhere I belonged instead. Those aren't always the same thing. When you're lucky, they are. She considered this with the gravity she brought to important information, and then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the book she'd been reading. I went back to my work. Outside, the evening settled over the hills of Ashvale in its unhurried way. The same light it had always been, golden and wide and patient, falling over a territory that had learned, through effort and difficulty and many small decisions made honestly, what it meant to take care of its own. And inside the estate, in the rooms that had become home so thoroughly that I could no longer fully remember what not having a home had felt like, the fires burned steadily through the coming dark, tended and certain, the way some things are when they have finally found their place.